is focused on using depth of field in a camera with the Arnold renderer in Maya 2019. In case you're not aware of what depth of field means, it's a term from photography and cinematography. It talks about basically the what's in focus and what's out of focus in an image. This image over here on the right, a large depth of field or a wide depth of field basically means that everything in your foreground all the way into the background is all going to be in focus, right? Versus a narrow depth of field would be only this little like animal's head would be in focus, and everything from there to the camera would exponentially blur out, and everything beyond that would blur out. So you'll see like a narrow depth of field in portrait photography a lot, where they focus on the models, like a feature of the model's face, and then everything softly blurs out into the distance. There's lots of great examples out there, and this is really works with the aperture. And and of course your shutter speed as well. But basically, like if you have a more narrow aperture, like you have over here in f22, you're going to have a wider depth of field. Like the light trickles in slower in to expose itself to the sensor of the film, and then gives you a wider depth of field. A more narrow would have a wide open aperture, a lower number, but a wide open aperture. So aperture is one of those key factors that controls depth of field. But like there's a very narrow depth of field, right? Even these blades of grass in front of this flower and everything beyond it are out of focus. Versus like photography of Ansel Adams or other people that have a very wide depth of field, where like literally I can see all this scrub brush plus the mountain in the background, everything's in perfect focus. So depth of field is really key in rendering and in what do you want to focus on, what do you don't want to focus on. So in Maya, we're going to just do a simple kind of setup here. I have 4 spheres, and I used the Arnold standard shader or standard surface with a little checker box pattern for the color. You can always access this under color, and if I right click on it, if I was going to add a new material, if you go to Arnold and AI standard surface, and then click on color and checker, you'll see there's a checker pattern right there. So that's how I added those to these 4 cylinders, and then I just kind of spaced them off, you can see from above. And I added a floor with the same pattern. It all has a little bit of a glossy specular quality, and I added a area light to it just to give it a little bit of light to work with, right? All right, so I'm going to focus in on this window. So one of the first things you want to do before you get started with depth of field is you want to go ahead up to display and go down to heads up display, and let's go ahead and turn on object details. Once you do that, you'll see this lovely little heads up display here. And the key item we're going to work with is this distance from camera, 17.055. For that object, you'll see it changes. As I click on different objects, it gives me the distance from the camera, which is going to be really key for depth of field. Heads-up display has lots of different stuff you can turn on. If you're in gaming, you can have the number of polygons, so you can really like keep track of your polygon count. There's all sorts of great heads-up displays that you can turn on and off depending on what task you're doing. Alright, now that I have that, I want to select the camera. I could add a camera to the scene, but if I just want to choose my perspective camera right now, I can click this little button right here in the top left of the viewport. It's called Select Camera. When I do that, you'll see over here in my attribute editor, I get all those camera controls, right? And let me fold all these up. By default, you might just see this, which is like angle of view, focal length, etc. We want to open up, you'll see there is a depth of field, but that's for the old legacy render. For Arnold, we want to open up the Arnold renderer, and we want to basically come on down here, and just below camera type, perspective, all of that, you'll see a little toggle that says enable depth of field. We want to toggle that on, okay? So you want to make sure that's on and you have turned on the depth of field in the Arnold tab, not the other old legacy depth of field up there. Now we want to go ahead and locate a distance that we want the camera to focus on. So I'm going to say this second object, so the second sphere, which is distance from camera, is 11.187. Keep in mind that's the center of the object, that's not the front or the back of it, it's based on where that center axis is. So I'll say roughly 11 for right now. Let's reselect the camera. And then once I'm in the camera here, I can set that focus distance. I already had it set there, but I can set it to 11. So it should focus on this sphere, and then everything forward will be blurry, everything beyond it will be blurry. The other one, as I mentioned, is aperture size. It's really important that you open up the aperture. If I put it at 0, there would be no depth of field in the scene. So I'm just starting off with this, like, let's try 0.3 to begin with. And now I'm going to bring up my Arnold render preview. So I'm going to bring that guy up, and I'll go ahead and render. And you'll see, there we go, the second one is in focus, the foreground is a little out of focus, and then exponentially the ones beyond it get out of focus. Now you'll also notice the amount of render time. This is only 960 by 540. It's really low res, and it's still taking probably about 20-30 seconds to fully render this. Depth of field exponentially increases your render time. And this is really based off of the sample settings. So if you click on your render settings and bring up the render settings tab, you'll see common. If you go on the Arnold tab, this sampling here is really going to affect your render time significantly. So I have it at 3 right now. If I say change that to 5, my render time is going to go even longer, but I'll get a higher quality blur. If you run this down too low to like 2 or something, it'll render faster, but you're going to get a lot of noise in the blur. As you can see, I have all this like pixelization that's showing up in the blur. So it really comes down to how powerful is your computer, how much render time do you have, do you need to let this render overnight to get the quality that you want. Obviously, if I go up to 5 again, then I get a much softer blur, way less noise as those areas start to fill in with their final render. So you got to find that happy balance, but remember, that's just the camera one there. I could also mess around with the diffuse, the specular, which is because there's a lot of reflection and surface types going on here, right? Okay, I'm going to, for sake of previewing, I'm going to put that at 2 though again, just so that this renders up rather quickly. So maybe I don't want it on the second sphere. Well, what if I click on the fourth? Then in my heads-up display, I can see that's at the 18 inches from my camera. So I'll click on select camera, and then I'll change focus distance to 18. Now you can see, boom, it's focused back on that sphere back at the back of the line. And now everything else is exponentially blurry. So, depth of field can be done in compositing and post as well, but considering the reflective nature we have in the floor, that's a lot to do, making it work just right. There are some tricks you can do with blurs and masks and layers in Photoshop that might not take as long, but there's some really cool stuff that you can do in camera in Maya like this, and depth of field happens to be one of them. We can play around with aperture blades. I'll let you kind of look at that on your own in a more advanced tutorial in the future. There's some other things in here, but for the most part, focus on the focus distance, the aperture size, getting your scene set up, and then also playing with that sampling rate inside of the render settings, and you should get some really beautiful renders in the end. All right, that's it. Pretty simple to get set up, but obviously lots of nuances in between. So have fun, and thanks for tuning in.